welcome as we come now to the fourth week of regular, or what we call ordinary regular time. This is the time that spaces now this year between the celebration of the Christmas season and the beginning of the Lent Advent season, or Lent Easter season. We are looking in the Gospel at the first chapter of Mark. Now, these are the readings before we start, just so that we have them. The first reading comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. From the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 7, verses 32 through 35. And the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. Now, as I have mentioned before, that the gospel that we're going to look at is divided into a number of sections, namely four different sections in chapter 1. We heard the first one last week, which was the call, you remember, of four of the disciples or four of the apostles to be with Jesus as he formed this new family. We now come to where we're going to see three miracle stories. And this time the first, this is, I'll just give you a little bit of the background here in terms of how we break down this chapter. Verses 21 through 28 we're going to see Jesus is casting out an unclean spirit. Then verses 29 through 31, we'll find him healing Simon's mother-in-law. And then verses 40 through 45, he will be healing a leper. So what we find in this opening chapter is that Jesus is pictured as a teacher, but much more he's pictured as what he is doing. So, how shall we? Let us look, first of all, at the material that's found here. It is pictured that Jesus has moved now to Capernaum, and he is teaching, we are told, in the synagogues on the Sabbath. Now, what we're not quite so sure of is that we really know very much about how the synagogue movement works. We do not have very much information about the customs in the synagogues at the time in which Jesus was teaching. We presume that visitors taught or preached only at the invitation of the leaders of the synagogue. And what is different here is apparently Jesus doesn't wait for an invitation. Now, Capernaum is where the synagogue is. We have mentioned this on a number of occasions. Capernaum, or Capernaum, as some would pronounce it, was an important trade place. We mentioned last time that it was a place known for its fishing capabilities and for its fishing sales, and that it was also a place where a toll road had been established, which brought in income not only to the whole area but also to the government. And never lose sight that in this Gospel of Mark there is a kind of challenge when the idea of the Messiah is brought to our attention against those who are the powers governing the ordinary people, not only of the Galilee, which is where Jesus spends much of his ministry in Mark's story, but also throughout the whole of Judea. So Jesus is pictured now as in the synagogue teaching. Now the question is, and as he is teaching, he is approached by a man who possesses an unclean spirit. Now, one of the ways in which the term unclean spirit is often translated is a demon. And as we've noticed before, there's a distinction between calling up or calling to mind the devil, Satan, and a demon. Clearly, Satan has his own particular understanding. The devil has a particular understanding, but a demon has to do, and this is the understanding that we need to maybe explore here a little bit, is, well, an unclean spirit. Now, the world in which the gospel is written is not the world in which we are perhaps familiar. And it's important to believe that the ancestors who kind of framed the first century or the Mediterranean world thinking believed that spirits were very powerful, and they were more powerful often than humans, but less powerful than God. So in a certain way, there's a belief in a world of spirits who can intervene in human life. And that may not be our way of looking at it today, but it was a way in which certainly the writer of the gospel and certainly Jesus came to understand. Spirits, therefore, intervened or interfered in human life. Sometimes they intervened benevolently. They were kind spirits. Sometimes capriciously. One didn't know what the spirit was going to do, and sometimes maliciously, that they were therefore causing harm or disruption. And here's the understanding that the spirits had power to control human behavior. So that's kind of the background here as this demon or this spirit shouts out to Jesus. The spirit and asks, and there's a kind of dialogue, as you will hear, that goes on between Jesus and this spirit or spirits. Now we're not, sometimes the text makes it a singular, sometimes makes it a plural. That only complicates things a little bit. But as I mentioned, a spirit is now pictured as knowing better than anyone else who Jesus is. The spirits know what contemporaries or patriarchs don't know, and the phrase that they have, or that they know, that Jesus is the Holy One of God. Now, Jesus now enters into this conflict with the spirit in the man. Jesus here is pictured as not controlled or cowed by this unclean spirit. Jesus shows that he has a power that is stronger than that of the spirit. Now, the spirit says to Jesus, "What do we have to do with you?" So they want to enter into this kind of a combat with Jesus. Now, that phrase could be interpreted in a couple of ways. First of all, it could be what they are asking Jesus is the cause of enmity between you and us. And there is some biblical background for this, because a similar kind of situation is discussed in the book of Judges, chapter 11, verses 12. I always give these little citations so that you can see the familiarity that the gospel writer, and Mark in this case, has with the scriptural tradition. That would be what we would call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. So that could be one of the reasons why this phrase is, what do we have to do with you? On the other hand, it could be, what do we have in common? What is it, Jesus, that you and we, the Spirit, share? And there's some reference, second book of Kings, chapter 3, verses 13, mentions this kind of dialogue that goes on. The demon wants to know why Jesus is taking such a hostile attitude toward them. And that's why they phrase it, "Have you come to destroy us?" So you see this dialogue takes place. There also is expressing a consciousness of their difference in nature, so that what Jesus is doing is not the same as what the spirits are doing. And they are concerned that Jesus is attempting to take control over them. This Jesus, the Nazarene. Now, keep in mind that Jesus here is breaking the tradition in which he had been raised. After all, who is this artisan who has come from Nazareth? He's not been known for anything particularly up to this point. Now he comes to Capernaum. Now he steps into the position of teaching in the synagogue with an authority which others have not seen. And an authority, where did he get this authority? Where did he get this power to do the things that he is doing? And that's the kind of tension now between the spirit or spirits and Jesus. The spirits, perhaps in one way, express a certain terror at what Jesus is doing. After all, if what he is doing is something that is unheard of before, and again, those terms that we sometimes use here, particularly when we look at Mark, eschatological or apocalyptic, is this Jesus truly the Messiah? Is he the one who is going to remove the power of spirits and change things in such a way that they will not be able to operate the way that they have been accustomed? Jesus, remembers, orders the spirit to be silent and to come out of the man. He does it out of, a violent protest, tearing at the human heart as his last expression of malice. Notice that's what the Spirit does. He obeys what Jesus says, but he kind of gives a punch before one last time to the man who the Spirit has taken over. So notice all of this is based on a belief that is certainly contemporary to Jesus' time. Is Jesus therefore inaugurating a holy war with the spirits? Is that what they sense is happening and what they are concerned about as not taking place? So all of this shows that there's a kind of tension between what is going on in the synagogue. Now, we're not sure and we're not told what Jesus was actually saying. As we mentioned a number of times when it comes to Mark, it's always a kind of action, something that Jesus is doing. And as we said at the beginning, this could be certainly the first miracle where Jesus calls out or expels the evil spirit from the man. People now have an answer to the question. What bothers them is this God who is at work through Jesus, or is it a world of lesser gods or spirits? So whom does Jesus serve? And thus the phrase, "We know who you are, the Holy One of God." Now, the Holy One of God, as we tend to interpret it, of course, from what we would call a Christological or a Jesus point of view, the Holy One of God tells us something about the nature of who Jesus is. Clearly understand here that Jesus is an exorcist. He has the power to cast out these spirits. And what this causes to the eyes of the observers, and it is a phrase that Mark regularly uses in this gospel, in fact, twice in this episode, it causes amazement. People are really astounded. Something new is happening. And that's, as we've mentioned on a number of times, a characteristic of Mark, that something new is taking place. This is not simply, another continuation, but in a different form of something that already had occurred in the past and might even was going on in Jesus' time, but something new is coming into the human story, into the human experience. And so as the spirit leaves the man, it shrieks. You notice one of the things that Mark often uses are words that kind of play to the hearing. And I point this out because keep in mind that the original gospel was not read to people, but was proclaimed to people. So very much the message and the meaning and the understanding came through the voice, through hearing, that is, played to the ears. We are more accustomed, perhaps, to reading it, and of course we do have the gospel written for us, but in the instance in which these narrations are taking place in Jesus' time, it is vocal rather than visual. So that, again, is important why terms ears are often more regularly used than eyes. Certainly you can see things, but the message, the word, is coming through hearing. So Jesus here now has the power and authority. And again, the question raised and really not answered is, where does Jesus get this authority? Well, as we read Mark, and again, we are reading Mark, it is an authority which comes from God. Jesus is acting not on his own, but as a missionary, as a messenger of God. So all of that is kind of a background for this opening chapter or opening section of the first part of Mark's story. Now, I want to say a word or two about Paul's message in the first letter to the Corinthians. This, of course, is one of the more significant and important letters of Paul. We draw many kind of understandings of what was going on in the early Christian community from this letter, and we have commented on parts of it in the past. But the section that we are told about in the section that we hear this time is that Paul seems to indicate that those who are unmarried are in a better position than those who are married. In terms of, and this is the issue here that I want to maybe look at for a minute, in terms of loyalty. Often this is interpreted as that the one unmarried has more loyalty to God and to the ways of God than the one who is married. Now, do keep in mind what we have noticed on other occasions, that in this first century way of thinking, everything in the world comes in limited qualities or quantities. See, we live in a world in which there are unlimited quantities. We've spoken about this before in terms of money, that there is only so much money to go around, that if one person gets richer, someone else or some other group gets poorer. It's merely a shifting of the quantities. Now, this is also true about loyalty, see, and that's the background for this little section. So if the idea of loyalty is shifted, then it moves from one person or position to another. We in the Western culture, as we've noticed on a number of times, believe in unlimited or limitless qualities. And so, from our point of view, loyalty can be to family, loyalty can be to occupation, loyalty can be to hobbies, in our culture, it's possible to accept and expand our loyalties and still continue to do the positions or the missions that we are called to. In fact, in our time, we use an interesting phrase, do we not? Namely, we speak, and I hear this, well, we have quality time, that certain aspects of our regular life are set aside to do maybe a little bit more with a family, or a little bit more with a person, or a little bit more with our religious responsibilities than at other times. Paul, therefore, does not think this way. He thinks in terms of a limited amount of loyalty. Paul does not consider that a wife's will should coincide with the Lord's will, or that pleasing a wife should be identical with doing the Lord's will. Now that's important to notice. He doesn't equate that, and sometimes interpretation seems to suggest that. Paul is really just simply saying that if you don't have a responsibility to a wife and family, then you would have more quality time, limited, dedicated to the work of the mission. So if you were free from marital obligations, you will be free for what he calls holiness in body and spirit. Paul requires that one be detached from all matters. Now, you have to, and caution here, because how this is, and you put together things that I've just mentioned, how this has been often interpreted in reading this little section. And again, cautious about taking things out of context. Once again, these are just 4 verses that come from this famous letter of Paul. Paul never says that the unmarried or the virgin have ipso facto achieved detachment. So what I mean by that is, just because they do this doesn't mean that they have successfully done what Paul is saying either. See, so just to say that one condition is better than others, and that's sometimes the way in which later Christian and Catholic tradition will interpret this, that those who kind of go in the state of unmarriedness are better than those who are married, is not what Paul is saying, although that is the way in which this section is interpreted. So I caution that we be careful about that, okay? Paul's understanding is, if we think of it, limited to his own time and background. So take in mind all of what we have mentioned here with regard to this little section. I'm not sure you'll get a homily on it, but I just want to develop that for a moment. The first reading comes from the book of Deuteronomy. Now, the book of Deuteronomy, of course, is the 5th book, you'll remember, of the famous Pentateuch. It generally recapitulates the kind of story of Israel's wandering in the years of moving from Egypt toward the Promised Land. And the book of Deuteronomy is pictured as a series, well, actually one great sermon, although when one analyzes it, there are two what shall we call sermons that Moses is pictured as delivering to the Hebrews as they are about ready to enter into the Promised Land. Moses is telling the people that he will not be able, for various reasons that are not clear, to join them as they enter into the Promised Land. But he does want to give them some encouragement that they remain faithful to the message which and to the, well, not only the message, but to the events that have helped shape their life to this point. So what we hear here is that Moses is now saying that although he will not be with them, that there will come one who will have also similar, if not greater authority than he has for doing and leading the Israelites as he had. So the choice for this little section, which is not really concerned with the whole message of Deuteronomy, but is rather concerned with this simple last little line that we hear, that one who will come will be one like Moses. All right, so we've noticed on a number of occasions how that is the background for much of what is discussed here. And certainly, as you now come to the gospel, Jesus' loyalty is to God, and therefore he is taking the Mosaic thought. He is the one who, like Moses, has total loyalty to God. And notice that that, of course, is stressed in the book of Deuteronomy, the loyalty that Moses had toward the message, and that Moses teaches with authority. Where does he get the authority? Gets the authority from God, so therefore that's the reason why he teaches. And that in a certain way, Moses too had authority over unclean spirits. In fact, he had warned the Israelites in other sections of the Deuteronomic tradition that they should be not listening to soothsayers, fortune tellers, those who in some way thought that they read the hearts and lives of people, that these were not the authority that belonged to them, but that the only authority that truly should be listened to would be the authority given to the prophets. And the greatest of the prophets, of course, was Moses. And so Moses had frequently instructed the people to avoid those kind of, well, how might we connect that reading with the gospel? Unclean spirits, see? So again, just to refresh ourselves here, belief in unclean spirits having these powers was common throughout the ancient world. And so we can't judge their time by our time. Well, we can do this, but we need to be, as we've noticed on a number of occasions, very cautious about doing that. So, when the demons, going back to the gospel, want to know why Jesus is taking a hostile attitude toward them, it is true that the power of goodness is coming to destroy the power of evil. On other upcoming occasions, we will notice, and again, I've mentioned this and I mention it here, that much of the evil of the time in the people's lives, particularly in the Galilee, was coming from the possession that the government, namely the Roman power, was exercising. So they saw evil spirits as being part of what was happening in their lives because of the occupation or oppression that was being enforced on them, both by Herod Antipas, who was the Jewish king or leader, but also by the Romans. And although I think we've mentioned in the past that there was great upheavals had happened in the Galilee, and Rome had come in and suppressed them and exercised its power over them. So this was seen as an oppressive, evil, spirited power given by the government. We are quite frequently told to separate the government from religion, but as we've noticed in other times, that didn't happen again in the first century world. So the Romans brought their gods, their spirits with them. But the God of Moses and the God of Jesus is the God who gives authority to them to speak the truth and to bring into a world that was hurting the healing gifts. So casting out the demon is what, as an exorcist, Jesus is pictured as doing here in our story today. We will pick up more on this as we come to the next episode next time. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.